May 3rd, 1775, Palace of Versailles. In the Hall of Mirrors, Marie Antoinette sits motionless for 4 hours while her hairdresser, Léonard Autié, constructs a towering masterpiece on her head. The coiffure rises 3 feet high, a sculpture of curls, ribbons, feathers, and jewels. But the foundation of this architectural wonder is 40 pounds of wheat starch, ground from grain, the same grain that has vanished from Paris bakeries. 12 miles away, in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, bakers shutter their windows. The shelves are empty. Bread prices have doubled in 6 months. A single loaf now costs more than a laborer's daily wage. By noon, a crowd has gathered at the Rue du Faubourg. 200 people, then 500. Someone throws a stone. The bakery window explodes. Within minutes, the crowd swells to 30,000. This is the Flour War of 1775, the deadliest food riot in French history, before the Bastille, before the guillotine. This is where the revolution actually began, and it started with a hairstyle. Back at Versailles, Léonard opens another canister. Inside, pure white wheat starch powder, ground from premium grain. He scoops handfuls and works it through the queen's hair until every strand is ghostly white. The amount of grain in Marie Antoinette's hair today could bake 64 loaves of bread, enough to feed a family of 6 for an entire month. Instead, it will be washed out tomorrow and thrown away. But Marie Antoinette is not alone. Every aristocrat at Versailles powders their hair. Multiply 40 pounds by 3,000 nobles. That's 60 tons of grain, transformed into fashion, not food. The wheat doesn't come from French farms. It comes from beneath the palace itself. Secret tunnels, built under Louis XIV, snake through the foundation of Versailles. They were designed to store grain for sieges. These tunnels hold enough wheat to feed 8,000 families for a year. But palace records show a different use. 90% of the grain is diverted to powder mills. Not bakeries, powder mills. In Paris, the riots intensify. Bakers are dragged into the streets. 2 are beaten to death. The Lieutenant General of Police sends word to Versailles. The city is burning. The king must intervene, but Louis XVI is hunting. At 3 p.m., a messenger interrupts the queen's toilette. Marie Antoinette, her coiffure finally complete, dismisses him with a wave. Léonard applies the finishing touch, lavender oil mixed with animal fat to set the powder. The smell is overwhelming, sweet rot and flowers. The pomade recipe is a closely guarded secret, rendered beef tallow, lavender essence, and wheat starch paste. After 3 days in the Paris heat, the mixture turns rancid. The smell becomes so foul that courtiers carry perfumed handkerchiefs just to approach the queen. But that stench, rancid butter mixed with lavender, becomes the signature scent of Versailles. Visitors can smell the palace from a mile away. They call it the perfume of power. What they're actually smelling is spoiled food, literally rotting on the heads of aristocrats. By evening, the Flour War has claimed 23 lives. Hundreds are injured. The army finally arrives, but the damage is done. The people of Paris have learned something. Their rulers value fashion over survival. They will remember this lesson 14 years later at the gates of this very palace. May 3rd, 1775, Paris erupts. Not over politics or war, but over flour. The Flour Wars would leave hundreds dead in the streets, and at the center of it all, Marie Antoinette's 3-foot powdered wig. While 30,000 Parisians starved outside the palace gates, the queen's hairdresser mixed 40 pounds of wheat starch into a single hairstyle. 40 pounds, enough to feed a family for 2 months. The grotesque math was simple. One aristocratic hairstyle consumed more grain than a peasant family would see in weeks. And Marie Antoinette wasn't alone. Every noble at Versailles competed in this flour-drenched beauty arms race. But here's what historians buried for centuries. Secret tunnels beneath Versailles stockpiled enough grain to feed 8,000 families. Not for bread, for wig powder. This wasn't just vanity, it was economic warfare. The Flour Wars weren't a spontaneous riot. They were the inevitable explosion when survival collides with decadence. The powder itself reeked. Wheat starch mixed with lavender oil to mask the smell of rancid butter and unwashed scalp. The aristocracy literally wore rotting food on their heads while children starved. May 3rd began with bread prices doubling overnight. By noon, bakeries were ransacked. By evening, the riots had spread to over 300 towns across France. The body count climbed past 200. King Louis XVI's response? He blamed the poor for not budgeting properly. Marie Antoinette never said, "Let them eat cake," but her 40-pound wig said something far worse. Let them eat nothing. The secret flour tunnels tell the real story. Palace records show 15,000 pounds of grain diverted monthly, not to feed people, but to powder heads. This was policy, not accident. This is where revolution was born. Not in 1789, but here in 1775, when thousands realized their children's hunger was a fashion choice made by people who would never know starvation. The flour wars were the dress rehearsal. 14 years later, those same streets would run red again, but this time the mob wouldn't stop at the bakeries. They'd storm Versailles itself. By the time the riots ended, 237 people were dead. The palace continued powdering wigs for another 14 years, until the guillotine made hairstyles irrelevant. This wasn't about bread. It was about a system so broken that beauty standards killed, and the people in power considered that an acceptable cost of elegance. 1774, France's wheat harvest is the best in a decade. Yet in Paris, bakers' shelves stand empty. A loaf of bread that cost 8 sous now costs 16. The people are starving, but the grain has vanished. At Versailles, 12 miles away, Marie Antoinette sits for her morning coiffure. Léonard Autié, the Queen's hairdresser, begins constructing today's creation, a 3-foot tower that will require 40 pounds of powder. The powder isn't chalk or talc, it's wheat starch, pure flour, milled fine as silk, mixed with lavender oil to mask the smell of rancid fat used to hold the hair in place. One aristocratic wig consumes more flour in a week than a peasant family eats in a month. Versailles alone houses 10,000 nobles and courtiers, each one powdered daily. Palace records, hidden for centuries, reveal the scale: 1.2 million pounds of wheat flour annually, enough to bake bread for 8,000 families for an entire year. Instead, it sits in the hair of people who've never known hunger. But why the shortage? Speculators bought grain cheaply after harvest, then held it in warehouses waiting for prices to climb. It was profitable, it was legal, it was murder by economics. Léonard Autié wasn't just a hairdresser. He was an artist, a celebrity, a businessman. His creations featured ships, gardens, even birds. Each required special powder mixtures. Each required more flour. Witnesses reported secret rooms beneath Versailles where Autié stored his materials. Not just powder, but grain itself, kept dry and ready for milling. Insurance against running out of his precious medium. The aristocracy believed appearance was power. To appear without powder was to appear poor, common, irrelevant. They would rather starve the kingdom than face society without their white clouds of status. April 27, 1775. The price of bread doubles overnight. In Paris, a woman named Marie throws a stone through a bakery window. By noon, it's no longer about one window. This is where beauty became bloodshed, where vanity collided with survival, where 40 pounds of powder in one wig meant 40 families without bread, and Paris was done asking politely. Chapter 2. The Rancid Perfume of Privilege. Here's what nobody tells you about 18th century wig powder. It was revolting. Wheat starch mixed with lavender oil to mask the smell of rancid pomade, a mixture of pig fat and beef tallow that held those towering hairstyles together. Marie Antoinette's pouf aux sentiments, a 3-foot monument to excess, required roughly 40 pounds of product. Contemporary accounts describe the Queen's chambers reeking of spoiled butter and flowers, a sickly sweet stench that clung to palace walls. Meanwhile, outside Versailles, women rioted for flour selling at 10 times the legal price. Léonard Autié, the Queen's hairdresser, used more grain in a single styling session than a peasant family consumed in 2 months. The irony wasn't lost on the starving. Their weekly bread ration was literally being dusted onto aristocratic heads. But here's the twisted part. This wasn't ignorance. It was calculated spectacle. The bigger the wig, the more powerful the statement. Records show Versailles went through 1,200 pounds of wig powder weekly. That's enough flour to bake 30,600 loaves of bread. And the smell? Former palace servants described it as death-wearing perfume. The rancid fat would spoil within hours in elaborate styles. Women who wore these structures for days developed scalp infections. Lice infestations were common. Some wigs contained mouse nests. Marie Antoinette's coiffure kept live bird cages woven into her hair for a royal garden party. They died from the pomade fumes within hours. This was the grinding reality. Privilege literally stank, and everyone could smell it. By spring 1775, bread prices had tripled. Wig powder consumption at Versailles, it doubled. This wasn't coincidence, it was a declaration of dominance. The flower markets of Paris became war zones. Bakers accused of hoarding were dragged into streets. Some were killed. But inside Versailles, Léonard Autié unveiled his masterpiece, a 4-foot wig depicting a naval battle, complete with ships. It required 60 pounds of wheat starch. The message was clear. We have so much, we can afford to waste it on spectacle while you starve. Let them watch us powder. Chapter 3. The Secret Tunnels Theory. Beneath the golden halls of Versailles, revolutionary whispers spoke of something darker than wine cellars. Palace financial ledgers from 1775 reveal purchases of grain, enough to sustain 8,000 families for an entire year. Yet outside the gates, Parisians were dying. Revolutionary pamphlets screamed of hidden stockpiles, underground chambers where wheat vanished while mothers watched their children waste away. But were the tunnels real, or something far more mundane and equally damning? Some historians point to the palace larders, vast storage rooms that could hide a scandal in plain sight, rooms where grain became not bread but vanity. Others discovered the beauty supply chambers, entire rooms dedicated to wig maintenance, mountains of wheat starch transformed into hair powder for the elite. Here's what matters. While the truth of tunnels remained murky, the truth of hunger was crystal clear, and rage has perfect vision. May 3, 1775, a grain convoy rolls toward Versailles, guarded, urgent. The people of Paris have been watching, waiting, starving. They don't see a delivery, they see theft, their survival, rolling past them, bound for powdered wigs and aristocratic excess. The convoy never reaches the palace gates. Hundreds swarm the wagons, guards flee, grain sacks are torn open, not stolen, but reclaimed. This is the moment whispers become roars. The flower wars have begun, and whether the tunnels were real or myth no longer matters. The people believe, and belief is enough to burn a kingdom. April 27, 1775. The grand ballroom at Versailles glitters with 1,000 candles. Outside, Paris is burning. Marie Antoinette's hairdresser, Léonard Autié, has spent 6 hours constructing his masterpiece. 4 feet tall, 3 pounds of pomade, and enough wheat powder to bake 40 loaves of bread. When the Queen enters the ballroom, witnesses report something extraordinary. A visible cloud of powder follows her like fog. Each movement releases another white puff into the air. The powder isn't just wheat starch. It's mixed with orris root, lavender oil, and animal fat to make it stick. In the April heat, it's already turning rancid. 3 miles away in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, bread costs have tripled in 2 weeks. A baker's shop window is shattered. The flower wars have begun. The riots aren't about hunger alone, they're about mathematics. While Marie Antoinette literally wears enough grain for a family's weekly supply, children are eating sawdust mixed with chestnuts. Finance Minister Turgot presents King Louis XV with a desperate proposal. Ban all decorative use of wheat products immediately. The nobility would have to choose between vanity and violence. The king's response takes less than 30 seconds. Request denied. The court's appearance, he reasons, maintains the prestige of France. Prestige requires powder. Powder requires wheat. What the king doesn't say, Versailles has a financial stake in the powder trade. Palace suppliers have contracts worth hundreds of thousands of livres. Banning wheat powder means breaking those contracts. May 3, 1775. The riots reach Versailles itself. 3,000 protesters march on the palace gates demanding bread. The Queen is having her hair dressed for the evening reception. Marie Antoinette never said, "Let them eat cake." But in a sense, she was wearing it. Layers of wheat paste, sugar water, and lard sculptured into a monument to excess. The palace guard opens fire. 7 protesters are killed instantly. 12 more die from wounds over the following days. The Queen doesn't cancel her appearance. Inside the ballroom, the orchestra plays. Outside, the death toll rises. By May 10th, between 100 and 300 people are dead across France. all over the price of flour. Turgot writes in his diary, "They have chosen powder over peace. The fuse is lit, and no one in this palace can smell the smoke. Their wigs are too perfumed." The flour wars end on May 10th with royal troops crushing the last riots. But something has changed. For the first time, French citizens attacked the king's forces over food. It won't be the last. Marie Antoinette's 4-foot wig becomes a symbol across Europe, not of French elegance but of catastrophic disconnect. Political cartoons show her head literally in the clouds. The palace continues ordering wheat powder, 20 barrels per week, enough to feed 8,000 families for a day. Instead, it decorates the heads of 300 aristocrats. 14 years later, those same Paris streets will fill again, but next time they won't stop at the palace gates. The flower wars were the dress rehearsal. The revolution was opening night. The flower wars ended with blood and promises. The French government executed several grain merchants as hoarders, scapegoats to satisfy the mob's hunger for justice, if not bread. But the executions couldn't erase what had happened. For the first time, ordinary people had challenged royal authority with violence and won concessions. The monarchy had blinked. 14 years later, women would march on Versailles again. This time, they wouldn't leave without the king. The Women's March of 1789 dragged Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette back to Paris, prisoners in all but name. Marie Antoinette kept her towering hairstyles until the revolution made them impossible. Even as France burned, the powder continued flowing into Versailles until the day it didn't. Here's the part we don't talk about. We live in our own Versailles moment. Today's beauty industry consumes resources at rates that would make 18th century aristocrats blush. Wealth inequality in America has reached pre-revolutionary French levels. The top 1% controls more wealth now than aristocrats did in 1789. We've become what we once overthrew. We mock Marie Antoinette's excess from our phones, devices that require conflict minerals and create mountains of toxic waste. The powder changed, the priorities didn't. Influencer culture rewards artificial scarcity and conspicuous consumption. Limited drops, haul videos, thousands of dollars of products used once and discarded. The algorithm feeds on excess. A beauty influencer can use more products in 1 week than a working family spends on groceries in a month. We've normalized a level of waste that Marie Antoinette would recognize immediately. The flour wars started because 40 pounds of wheat became powder for hair instead of bread for families. Today, we call it content. Then we call it Thursday. Revolution doesn't announce itself. It accumulates in moments when people choose between feeding children or watching nobility powder their wigs, between rent and the algorithm's demands. Marie Antoinette never said, "Let them eat cake," but she didn't have to. Her hair said it for her. 3 feet of powdered indifference while Paris starved outside the gates. So here's the question we're afraid to ask. What's our breaking point? How much inequality can society absorb before the flour runs out and the people come for what's theirs? The flour wars teach us that revolutions begin with bread, or the lack of it, with small indignities that accumulate into rage, with the moment people realize there's enough. It's just not for us. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, and right now we're hearing echoes of 1775 in every algorithm that rewards excess, every paycheck that doesn't cover rent, every gate that separates abundance from need. The powder may have changed, the priorities haven't. And somewhere, Marie Antoinette's ghost is watching us make the same mistakes. One influencer haul, one rent hike, one viral excess at a time. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and check out other videos.